We'll start with the goals of philosophy of physical activity, and these would be the goals of people in the subdiscipline of philosophy of physical activity. And the first three are understanding. So, understanding the nature of health and physical activity, particularly the forms, different forms of exercise, sport, games, play, and dance. Secondly, understanding our level of confidence in the claims that we make. So that would be with research that we do. The third is to understand the most important values of physical activity, as well as its contribution to good living. And the fourth goal is to learn how we should behave in sport and in our professional lives as kinesiologists. So we'll start out by talking about why people use philosophical thinking. And I want you to think about if you've ever taken a course in philosophy. Some of you may have. But philosophers learn a lot by living in the world and experiencing it. So here we're talking about philosophy of physical activity. So people who are physically active or are sports participants, and they're critically reflecting and evaluating physical activity in the real world. So they're experiencing it, they're living in the culture of sports or physical activity, and then using logic, speculation, their imagination, and just thinking about why something is happening. So think about if you've participated in a team sport before, or even just maybe you participated in CrossFit or yoga or something like that, where you've done it as a part of a group and for a while. Thinking about, what makes people choose that activity over something else. And that's the kinds of things that they may think about. Or we'll talk later about sportsmanship. So what is sportsmanship? That might be something that a philosopher of physical activity and sport would think about. But the point in all of this is that even without controlled experiments like they might perform, exercise physiologists, for instance, are going to measure how fast you can run or what your VO2 max is. So those are what we would call controlled experiments where there are measurable outcomes. But in philosophy, they're doing more descriptive studies, and we can still get valid and reliable results from this type of studies. So the next thing we're going to talk about is 4 types of philosophical claims. The first is personal opinion. So that is something that you decide. Like I might say that UNC has a way better athletic environment than any other ACC team. That's my personal opinion, right? And in order for somebody to believe that claim, it needs to be reasonable. If I said that my personal opinion was that all athletes are poor students, that's really not reasonable to think that every athlete is not a good student. So that would be a claim that would be likely to be rejected by many people. The second type of philosophical claim is speculation. We can speculate on something, but then it needs to be plausible. Outlandish would be something that would be really a crazy kind of speculation. So I want you to think about something that you might be able to speculate on and is it plausible? And only in that case would it be something that people could believe. The third type of philosophical claim is a probable assertion. This is something that's likely to be true or partially true. So again, think of something that you might be able to make a claim about. Is it likely to be true or partially true? And in that case, then that would be a probable assertion. And finally, we have a truth assertion. This is a universal claim that is ethically and universally accurate. So an example here, this isn't really related to sport, but it's the example that they have in the textbook. Hatred and love are not the same thing. And so I think we all understand that that is true, that they're not the same thing. And so that would be a universal claim that someone could make, that hatred and love are not the same thing. So we're back to this graphic again. I want you to notice what's different this time. There's a couple of different things. And maybe see what you can tell is different. But this, excuse me, this time we are talking about how philosophy of physical activity and all of the other subdisciplines are interdependent. So if you look at the pie, there's not distinct portions of the pie. There's blurred lines between them. And so that represents that there's not distinct marks between them. We do need collaboration between different subdisciplines and between researchers and practitioners because theory is going to inform practice and vice versa. So when a researcher comes up with a new theory, they need to share that information with people who are working in sport, physical activity, and athletics, and see how well that fits. And somebody who is a practitioner who is working in a field that's related to physical activity needs to give information about what's going on in the real world to the researchers. And that's how they're interdependent with one another. So what philosophers are really doing is trying to better understand the world and our lives in it. And when we're talking about philosophy of physical activity, they want to understand human movement, which is physical activity. So these are 4 important branches of philosophy and the questions that philosophers in each of those branches may ask. So the first, and let's look at the right-hand side, the branch of philosophy, metaphysics, asks what is type of question. So like, what is the scope of our field would be an example. With epistemology, they're asking how do we know questions. So how confident can we be about the objectivity and validity of our attitudes and perceptions? Axiology asks what is important questions. So what really matters in kinesiology? And ethics is really probably where we'll spend a lot of our time in this course anyway, looking at how should we behave as kinesiologists. So these are should questions. This graphic from your textbook looks at different research methods, and you need to look at each of these. So if we're at the top with inductive reasoning, we start with a specific case. So they may observe an act of sportsmanship within a particular incident. And then they may develop general principles related to that from that one specific case. Deductive reasoning is the opposite. It would start with a general principle of what sportsmanship looks like, and then it would break it down based on what they have found in many different examples of sportsmanship. What are our commonalities? And then we would get specific examples over there on the right-hand side. With descriptive reasoning, we're looking at one example and trying to describe it. So we may go back to that one example that I mentioned for the inductive reasoning. And probably with the inductive reasoning, they would really have more than one specific case, maybe a few specific cases where they're looking at commonalities. With descriptive, they're going to just look at one example and say, okay, what does sportsmanship look like? What are those essential qualities? And then they're going to identify those through descriptive reasoning. We'll briefly talk about the history of philosophy of physical activity. This is just a tiny bit of what the chapter shares, but I do want you to know that it first emerged as a subdiscipline in the 1960s as philosophers started distancing themselves from educational philosophy because they were looking beyond just physical education. So that will make more sense after the next chapter where we talk about the history of physical activity and kind of where we started and where we are today. In the 1970s, they established the first professional organization. So that's when it was really officially a subdiscipline. And then they created a journal. And remember that we discussed that those are two hallmarks. A professional organization and a journal are two hallmarks of a subdiscipline. And we need the journal to publish research that philosophers do. And in order for it to grow as a subdiscipline, you need to create educational programs and people need to study it. So philosophy of physical activity actually grew very slowly. Now we're going to look at what do we know in the philosophy of physical activity. And the first thing is we need to look at who are our clients. We need to understand them as a person first so that we can understand why they're attracted to physical activity. And what we think about somebody affects how we deal with them. So we're going to, the beginning, focus on the nature of the person. That'll be the next group of slides that we cover. But then we'll also talk just very briefly about the nature of sport and competition and their relationships to work and play, the values promoted by physical activity, and the ethical values in sport. So let's start with the person problem. How do we know what we know about people? How do we understand the mind and body? We're going to look at three schools of thought here: materialism, dualism, and holism. The first is materialism, and this is the belief that humans are nothing more than a complex machine. They have subjective experiences, which are real, but they have no power over what's happening in the body. What you see is what you get, and it's a very simplistic view. If they're looking at defining health, they're probably going to say good health is the absence of disease. Dualism came along because a lot of people started thinking, well, that's not really accurate, and that the mind is important and separate from the body. And our thoughts count, and they can change our behavior. So think about a time when you were in, it could be anything, even a big test or a big competition where you got really nervous beforehand. And that would be your subjective, what's going on in your mind, you're worrying or you're thinking about what could happen. And then how did that impact your body? What happened in your body? What kind of feelings did you have? What kind of thoughts did you have? And then I also want you to look at this example here with these two athletes and think about what do their bodies tell you, and then what do you think is going on in their minds? Is one person helping the other person? Why would they do that? And so that's really kind of an example, an illustration of how we have two things at work, which is the core of dualism. What is going on in your mind impacts what's going on in your body. And good health is a sound mind in a sound body. Finally, we have holism, which is a middle ground between the other two. And people who are holists believe that the mind and body are interdependent and work together. All behavior is ambiguous, and the sum is, or the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So think about a time when you've been on a team that did way better than everyone expected. And that's because of team chemistry, right? So you may not have the most talented team, but when they work together really well and they will do anything for the coach and they buy into the coach's plan and program, then a lot of times they're more successful than they would be otherwise, just based on what you can see on paper. So holists feel like good health is overall wellness.